I recognize I'm not dealing with the principle, I'm dealing with the dilemma about which I have to continue to cultivate the wisdom to know the difference for the rest of my life. The wisdom between when to be tolerant, when to be intolerant, when to be judgmental, when not to be judgmental. And I'll recognize that I won't get it right always, which means that I'll say things with conviction, even though I know I could be wrong.
Hello and welcome to Self-Talk. I'm Rachel Astarte. Today, my guest is Jeremy Sherman, who is a longtime researcher focusing on knowing ourselves better through what he calls cradle-to-grave scientific research. His area of research is very broad. He talks about and researches the origins of life, humans, and recently, Psychoproctology in his book, which we will be discussing, What's Up with A-Holes? Advanced Psychoproctology for Beginners. He researches with top scientists while producing accessible podcasts, videos, books, and blog articles. Jeremy, welcome to Self-Talk.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Yes.
So before we get into the psychoproctology, which I'm very curious about, tell us how you got into doing what you do.
It came about through a midlife crisis around the age of 37 or so. A lot of people go through these transitions. And in my case, I had been one of the people who, like many, believed I was spiritual, not religious. I had Buddhist leanings, all of that. Mm-hmm. And I was beginning to find the answers that I had settled for to be insufficient to the life I had to explain and manage. Mm-hmm. So those answers became springboards to next questions for me. And rather than going to another sacred text, I went to natural science. I realized that if I wanted good guesses at what this whole ball of wax is and what our role in it, what our, and us on this ball of wax or in this ball of wax, that going to the natural sciences was a good place to go. I started studying evolutionary theory, ended up in a program to get a PhD in a cross between evolutionary theory and decision theory, which is basically how people shop among interpretations of their situation. Mm-hmm. And ended up falling into the good company of a Harvard neuroscientist, biological anthropologist named Terence Deacon, who had just written a book on the evolution of language, a book that made me cry when I read it because not because it was moving, but because it was extremely difficult.
Because I get moved by language, so I thought, I'm with you. Oh, now I see.
No. At Harvard, they say that he wrote like a truck. That his stuff is incredibly dense, and yet shortly after that we met, and he had just turned his attention to a very big question that's overlooked in the sciences, which is what is trying and how did it start?
Yes,
it's organisms try and other things don't. Inanimate things don't. Rocks don't. Computers don't try. Mm-hmm. They don't struggle for their own existence. And a lot of people think that evolution explains the struggle for existence, whereas Darwin would not have said so. He would have said, no, I had to assume the struggle for existence and explain how it evolves or adapts to different circumstances. That's what his game was about.
Right.
So we've been working together now for a quarter of a century. So in a way, my whole range, my middle age spread is from the origins of life to the evolution of language and how it alters the adaptive process. All organisms have to adapt to reality or die, and here we are doing it under the disorienting influence of language. And then from that, because my first career was actually in political activism of one sort or another, or social change. In fact, I had belonged. My first big job was 7 years on the world's largest spiritual commune, the Farm in Tennessee. I lived there.
Oh wow! Okay, all right.
so this was my second career, but I had been focused. By the time I met Terry, in the 80s, I had founded a national nonprofit lobbying organization with 75 chapters working on environmental issues.
Beautiful.
So I always had my eye on political issues, and psychoproctology ended up being the obvious place to go next. There's a lot of spiritual and moral philosophy talk about how we should behave.
Yes.
And I noticed that looking around the world, there are lots of viable lifestyles. For me, the question became not what we should all do, but what we should all don't. And the folk psychology term for what we shouldn't be is a-hole. So, and I noticed that we had no clear definition of it. So in this new book, I'm basically trying to understand from a social science perspective, what is an a-hole? How would you most objectively operationalize a definition of an a-hole? And how do you stop them without becoming one?
Yeah,
so
beautiful.
that's the general, that's the story.
I love it. I mean, and there's so much, this is so chewy. I can just jump right in. But yeah, so there are a lot of questions, and I love your organic pathway to finding what, to where you are now. Yeah. I'm asking these big questions. So, it's sensational. So of course, that's why I want to talk about, do you prefer the term a-hole or asshole? Which one is you?
Actually, I spend 250 pages in this book, or a few chapters in the podcast version of it, because it's available for free as a podcast. Working towards an explanation by which we could then come up with a better term than any of the terms out there.
Okay.
A term that's actually more accurate and precise. And I come down to by the end of that, there's a spoiler. Okay. I come to the term Trump bot, and no, it's not based on Donald Trump, though he does manifest this characteristic well. What I mean by Trump bot, Trump is an interesting word because it actually means two things. It means fake, trumped up, and it also means beats everything.
Right.
So there are, in the book, I explain how one can robotically get in the habit of playing trumped up trump cards. And also why this would naturally follow from who we are and how we got here. All organisms are struggling for their existence,
right?
In a world that is where everything degenerates. So what does it mean to struggle for our existence? It doesn't mean replicating, like copying little molecules. No, it's actually a hustle that we do all the time, which is we have to protect against degeneration and repair whatever degenerates about us. So if you take that, that means we have to also selectively interact with our environment. That is, I have to take in the energy by which I can repair things, but I have to keep out the stuff that will degenerate me.
Right.
When you apply that at the level of language, you end up with confirmation bias. You take in the ideas that will regenerate your mojo, and you'll keep out the ideas that will degenerate your mojo.
Yes, and we see that so often right now in particular.
It's a human condition. It's absolutely necessary. The difference between normal people and Trump bots or assholes is that for normal people, that's a problem they recognize they have to manage. That is, they have to take in some critical feedback. For an asshole, it's the solution to all their problems.
Right.
And it's actually very easily done. So while we, in clinical diagnosis, we use terms like narcissist, I'm arguing actually that they may not, I know they appear self-infatuated, but I actually think it's more of a robotic habit than that.
Yeah. And so I think that because what I'm thinking about as you're saying all this is, again, from a clinical perspective, we talk about ego dystonic or ego syntonic. Ego dystonic means you're not aware that you have the mental illness or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Ego syntonic means, it's the opposite. You are aware. Ego syntonic means it's part of who you are. So you're not aware that you have, that you are a narcissist. So how does this work with Trump bots or assholes? Are they dystonic or syntonic?
They're they are not aware on purpose. So I think
Okay.
I think I've been talking to psychiatrists or colleagues about motivated mental disorder.
Mm.
There are real advantages to being an a-hole if you can get away with it. You know, we say crime doesn't pay. Well, crime pays really well if you can get away with it.
Right.
And that's why a lot of the book is actually about how to make it a costly behavior. That is, how to make it cost a-holes. There's a lot of talk about how you have to reach out to them and find affinities and respect their values. I'm saying, yes, that's absolutely how to behave with normal people. But when someone has gone robotic like this, that's exactly the wrong thing to do. It's enabling.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm saying is that there's actually they don't have to start out dumb or evil,
Mm-hmm.
but it frees them. The habit itself, which is actually quite easy to acquire and has nothing to do with what you claim to believe. I don't actually believe that assholes have beliefs. I don't think that if you've watched their behavior, it's not as though they believe it. They
Right.
just talk like they believe something so absolutely that it trumps all other considerations.
Mm-hmm.
But once you have the protection of your robotic strategy, what I call the wild card trump card formula,
Mm-hmm.
WTF, it's I can do anything. That's the wild card, and whatever I do is trumps all other possible things I could do. It's the figment of perfect satisfaction on two things all organisms would want, which is safety. That's
Right.
the trump card part, which is that I win no matter what,
Okay.
and freedom. That's what we would all want. All organisms would want that, if to the extent they could. So once you have that, any self-awareness is an encumbrance. It will only get in the way, and you can it's to your advantage, and you are free for it to atrophy. So you end up with this paradoxical situation where you've got mindless swellheads. That's the robotic part. They're not thinking,
Right.
they're not aware.
Right.
This is why I think narcissism may be a bit of a misnomer. I don't think they're actually self-infatuated. I don't think they realize they're there. They are playing God. God is disembodied. He's got all.
Right.
I actually think that God was invented, the monotheistic God was invented in an asshole's image.
Mm-hmm.
That is, they claim perfect integrity, like God's oneness. God can't contradict himself.
Right.
And they play omniscient, omnipotent, omnificent. That is, that they are all right, all righteous, and all powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it would be a very standard move. I expect if we found extraterrestrial life with language, they would have assholes just like we do.
Yeah. But, well,
it's a function of language.
Well, that's what I'm saying too. It's like it's a function also of survival.
Yeah.
But so that I think.
Two.
Yeah. And I think that's the real question that I'd like to delve into a little bit. You mentioned it earlier. How do you survive, evolve without becoming an asshole? Right.
Yeah. It's, I mean, that gets into a whole other realm of my work. I'm writing a lot these days about how irony, or being an ironist, is actually the most adaptive response to reality. Winds change. That is, there are going to be switchbacks even just in the physical world. And we living beings are trying to track the physical world, which means that we will end up with in ironic situations where we did what looked like the right thing and it turned out to be the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. Like if you're driving a winding road, and that means you have to turn right and turn left, and sometimes you'll be off a little bit. And so there's a kind of slapstick quality to life. Mm-hmm. If you think about the classic slapstick, the banana peel, you're pushing your foot back against the ground for traction, and the ground is not ground, it's a banana peel. So instead of going forward, you go backwards. That's right. A fundamental, inescapable part of reality.
Yes.
And there are three basic moves I see we can make with it. One is to deny that and claim that our formulas are always right, always do X, love is the answer, for example, any of those kinds of things. Mm. And if someone accuses you of not being loving, simply deny it. Just come up with some euphemism. No, I don't hate injustice. I just whatever. You come up with ways to pretend that you're actually living by some straight path, not having to do any switchbacks in reality. Another one is to become a cynical hypocrite, which is to say, since there are reversals and sometimes you make the bad decision or when you wanted to make a good decision, bad and good aren't real and I can do whatever I want.
Right.
So if someone says, you shouldn't be judgmental, and I said to you, shouldn't be judgmental is a judgment. That means that it's all bullshit and I can do whatever I want. That's the cynical, hypocritical approach.
Right.
But for me, for someone who's a devout ironist, when I see a contradiction like you shouldn't be judgmental or be intolerant of intolerance, I recognize I'm not dealing with the principle, I'm dealing with the dilemma about which I have to continue to cultivate the wisdom to know the difference for the rest of my life. The wisdom between when to be tolerant, when to be intolerant, when to be judgmental, when not to be judgmental. And I'll recognize that I won't get it right always, which means that I'll say things with conviction, even though I know I could be wrong. So that's the ironist stance.
Yeah, that's good. And it's the middle path. It's the Taoist, the middle way.
Yeah, almost. The difference is that so one way I frame this is hard left, hard right, hard center, hard choices. So let's take hard left. Love is the answer. And then you get burnt by that and you say hard right. Tough is the answer. And you get burnt by that and you say, no, tough love is the answer. That's hard center.
Right.
Like the middle path.
Right.
And I'm saying, and then you realize that doesn't work either. Tough love is the question: when to be tough, when to be loving. That's hard choices.
Right.
I mean, tough love would be if the Jews went to Hitler and said, look, you want to kill 6 million of us, we want you to kill 0. So the middle path, 3 million.
Yeah, no. That's practical. I'm talking about, the idea of finding the middle way, which I think touches on what you're saying, because
it does
being fluid and flexible. Not quantitatively, splitting it down the middle.
I totally agree. The middle way has come to mean both things. And I don't actually hold out for harmony anymore. I believe that dilemmas are way more fundamental than principles, even middle path principles. So that's why I end up making that distinction, to be very clear on the difference between hard center and hard choices, because there's a little ambiguity. I've seen it. I mean, I've been interviewed by the Middle Way podcast, and we ended up getting into a big conflict about this exactly thing, because they were basically claiming they had found the formula, which was always to cut things middle way. And no, that's not how it works.
Well, yeah, again, but we can't look at everything literally, and but right.
But so people do. So that's the only reason I mentioned that.
That's true.
I'm not. I didn't mean to correct you. I meant to clarify this. I meant to disambiguate. That's all.
Yeah, and then of course, because coming back to love, which of course love is the answer. There is a part that feels like even love kind of pervades everything anyway, but you have to redefine what love really means. And I think it does encompass what you're talking about, being able to be loving about whatever choices you're making, because they are choices, right?
Well, yeah, so I'm very clear that love is the question for me, not the answer. And part of that is that love is a statement, is a term for an extreme preference, and preferences are always relative.
Right.
So if I love something, I can't help but hate its opposite. If I love justice, I hate injustice. The more I love justice, the more I hate injustice. If I love my children, the more I would hate to see them harmed. So I don't want to mince words about that. I want to recognize that it's a preference thing. If I say I love you especially, I am actually in the process demoting other things to lower preference. And I don't want to mince words about that. So for me, the question is what to love. Even if I love my choices, and I want to love my choices, but not completely. I don't want to be infatuated with my choices.
Right.
I am what they call in philosophy a fallibilist. A fallibilist is someone, my distillation of it is, no matter how confident I am in a bet, I'm still more confident that it is a bet. Fallibilism is just a recognition that there are better and worse bets, but you never reach 100% certainty on anything. So I don't want to be infatuated. Right. I want to love my decisions. I want to feel good about my decisions, but I don't, an asshole, you'd say, loves their decisions, at least robotically, in that they're always the best decision that could ever possibly have been made.
Right. So let's talk about assholes for a second and what they look like. Let's talk about assholes.
What they look like.
What do they look like? How do I know? So I've, never mind. We won't get into my personal life.
but everybody, people light up at this topic. Some people light up in rejection of it. Like, there are no assholes, or everyone's an asshole. I mean, no, I get it. And there are real taboos against talking about it. I mean, I write for Psychology Today. I've got 950 articles up there on their blog site, and have some in the magazine. But no, it's very difficult for me to talk about it there. It's a touchy subject there. You can talk about clinical diagnosis. And in a way, one of the most popular topics up there is how to diagnose my ex as a narcissist or a psychopath.
Right.
That's a very popular topic. But everybody does feel like we're all kind of obsessed with them, with assholes, and for good reason.
Well, and also because we embody assholery in our own psyches as well, because that's what right. we are not one way or another. So the dark and the light have to come together. That's non-duality. But we have to love that too. So for some reason, when you were talking, I was thinking about, capital A assholes, like people who are making decisions that are destroying lives, kind of asshole. But there are many gradients of asshole, right? There are many different kinds of asshole. So
it's
that's actually a question, aren't there? Many different gradients of asshole.
Yes, there are, which makes it kind of a squirrely topic. So there are part-time assholes, and there are assholes with some people, and there are assholes on some topics and not others. And then there are some full wall-to-wall assholes and all of that. And what do they look like? They look like anything. I know Buddhist assholes. I know New Age assholes. I know leftist assholes. I know right-wing assholes. It's one of the challenges of writing a book on the subject, is that everybody thinks you got a vendetta against some kind of asshole. No, my book is really a strong attempt to be nonpartisan and non-denominational. It's not about what you claim to believe; it's how you strut it. And yes, I mean, I do tease about what's the dualistic alternative to non-duality, because actually I think there are some places where duality belongs. We do have to make some binary decisions in our life.
We live in a dual world, so of course we have to. I mean,
right, and a dual reality, not just the culture, but setting that aside. The book includes some ways of getting at some asshole tells. That is, some attempts to figuring out whether you're dealing with an asshole. But again, since I'm a fallibilist, it's always a bet. So when I'm dealing with someone online, for example, and getting my practice dealing with trolls or all that, I have a serenity prayer-like question. I want to be receptive with anybody who's actually receptive, even if they come out gangbusters, all yang and all that. I don't want to be receptive to someone who's unreceptive, and I'm always looking for the wisdom to guess whether, there'll be cases where I think I'm dealing with an asshole and I'm not. Right. And there are cases where I think I'm dealing with a normal person when they're actually being an asshole. And there is something about assholes. I think of them as like exhibitionists. They sidle up as if for conversation. Yes. And then when they've got your attention, they open their trench coat and show off their stiff little absolutism. And the reason they do it so proudly is that no matter how you respond, they have a way of claiming victory for it. Right. So if you walk away or if you shame them, whatever, they have a formula for dealing with anything that no matter what you do, they claim triumph.
Right.
That's the fun of being an asshole.
Right.
And so I guess one thing more I'd say about it is that the book also includes the last chapter on prevention and I think that, to your point, I'm a delusional asshole like anybody else. That is, I have that going on in me. I just try to play that out offline. Yes. So So I'm into optimal illusion, that is, or safe escapism. And I don't think it's a matter of how far out I go, but whether I remember to return to reality.
Right.
Yeah. So I can take my flights of fancy as long as I've got a return ticket to reality secure in my heart pocket. So I've been to a Trump rally, for example, and it's pure cosplay. It's just like a metal concert, or it's cosplay. People feel like badasses. They chant along with the lyrics. They're not actually listening to the lyrics or what they mean. They're not thinking about that. They just sound badass, just like at a metal concert.
Right.
The difference is that when people go to a metal concert, when it's over, they find their car and they go home and return to reality.
Right.
And the difference with cults, which is my definition, I'm not the only definition, but my definition of a cult is that it's the plural of asshole. The only difference is that a cult, they go home thinking that their fantasy was more real than reality.
Right.
And that's really dangerous. Whatever floats your boat, but not if it's going to make the waters choppy for everyone. So we have a perfect model for how to drain our asshole lizard brain in our way of dealing with fiction. I love gangster movies. I love identifying with gangsters. I totally feel it's completely real when I'm watching that thing.
Yes.
But if you tap me on my shoulders, I know it's not. I know it's not real. I remember where I am. So that's an important distinction. I think of that as a therapeutic approach. I don't think we can suppress the asshole entirely, the inner asshole.
Taking your inner asshole for a walk. Yeah.
For a safe walk.
For a safe walk. Yeah. Well harnessed.
Yeah. And so from my perspective, masturbation and church are actually both wonderful, healthy forms of safe escapism where you can feel like you're a badass. As long as you remember after it's over to zip up and get back to reality. That's basically the point.
Zip up from church?
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
I mean, so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to demote the highfalutin versions of escapism to an elevated status that I hold all escapism at. I think we need it. We couldn't possibly be realistic all the time.
Right.
We have to have these mojo pit stops, or else we just can't face that much. Reality is too much.
Yeah, I think that's really true too. And also our psyches and our unconsciouses are so like the wide, deep ocean. We don't know what little creatures live in there, and to be able to play with them in a safe area is so important. Absolutely. And that kind of is really what this podcast is about in many ways, is how do you connect with yourself in an honest way, which is to incorporate all of these elements. So,
including the honesty about our own dishonesty. That's the heart of it. So, and I just to make one connection, language really is mind-boggling. If you compare what a dog could worry about at night to what a human could worry about at night, it's just overwhelming what we deal with.
Yes.
We would be an anxious species, as would be any language using organism anywhere in the universe. And so language overwhelms us. I think of us as trudging through a sandstorm of mojo eroding possibilities. And it also affords us a shield against all those possibilities. So it both makes us more anxious and more escapist than other organisms.
Right.
And that's the human condition. I don't see any way out of it. So what you're describing is a way of managing that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's extensive language. I mean, if we really want to look at, birds have language, dogs have language too. There's a different
I would not say so. And so, I mean, there is debate about this, but in our school of thought, language is actually a different thing than the animal indexical calls that you get. There are a few animals that have learned a vocabulary of maybe 200 words, but try this out just to understand the radical difference. If I describe to you a rhinoceros with a candy cone nose in a tutu balancing the universe on the tip of its nose, this is all done with language, and you can imagine that.
Right.
Okay. There's no there's no evidence whatsoever that a bird language or the calls of birds, which are what we call indexical in semiotics, would give you any of that capacity. We are really living in two worlds: the worlds of the same world that all other organisms are living in, and the world of our language-fueled imagination, which we see no evidence of in other organisms. Sure, they could have all sorts of properties we don't see, but the way it works in evolution is if you're not actually using it, then you're not actually, you probably don't have it.
Yeah, I think I see the difference. I think it's communication, right? So like trees can communicate with one another when there's a species, there's a predator, and then they can under the ground and through the mycelial network talk to each other. And
they can communicate. So I work in biosemiotics, which is how interpretation or semiosis, the use of signs, works across living systems. So, for example, just last week, I handed in another academic article on biosemiotics. So I am right with you about communication.
Right.
Emotions. Dogs have emotions. Animals have emotions. I've spent a lot of time talking about how trees are trying. Bacteria is trying, because a lot of people have trouble imagining that something could try without thinking or feeling. I think that you can try without thinking or feeling.
Okay.
We have to be very careful about where we draw the parallels and contrasts across language, and there's across organisms, and there are lots of parallels and contrasts. But I would say that the rhino and the tutu thing is something I don't bet you could get trees or birds or chimps or dogs to understand. And it's not just about communication. Language isn't just how I communicate; it's how I think. Right. I could not imagine half the things that come to mind, even if I don't talk about them with anybody, without language. They're all done through a kind of combination of emotion and language.
Yes,
from my perspective.
Yeah, and this is when we're also talking human to human communication. So there may be stuff we have no idea what the birds are actually saying to each other. I mean, we have some idea.
No, we actually have a fair amount of idea. I mean, a lot of work. Our work is actually on how. I mean, we've done this interesting research on this one bird that actually got domesticated and bred for its coloration, and therefore lost its capacity for the calls became less relevant. That is, the selection on it relaxed. We think that language is actually, in large part, a product of the loss of capacities that freed us from involuntary calls. And yet involuntary calls are still part of what we do. That is crying, shrieking, moaning during sex. These are laughing. These are, you can fake them, but they are considered involuntary calls. And one of the most interesting to me is prosody, which is the emotional carrier wave for what we say. Da 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 da. That's called prosody. That's totally an involuntary thing. I can fake it if I want to. We do, and to be polite and all that, or to send a certain signal. Right. But it is running. So that's closer to what animals have. And yes, they're full of significance. But no, those involuntary calls are indexes. They point to a particular kind of thing. They don't point, you don't combine them the way we do words in syntax to generate whole worldview pictures. It's just an aside, but this is our approach to the issue.
Yeah, beautiful. Yes, so all this comes back to, how do we know, or how do we deal with, besides our own inner asshole, but what happens? I'm thinking of the example you gave, which is such a great one, when you're dealing with trolls on the internet, or a difficult friend or a family member. And one of the biggest things I get in therapy all the time is, I know I should react a certain way to the way that they're behaving, but I don't want them to get away with it. And it's troubling to me that I could let this asshole get away with it. As you said, I
have that problem too.
Yeah. So what do we do, Jeremy?
I suggest I have two main suggestions in the book. One is fierce fallibilism. You actually make them look like chumps for not seeing both sides of something.
Mm.
So, for example, we have a tendency to react to scolding from people who have not earned the right to scold us.
Mm.
I think this is one of the biggest problems we face these days. So if someone calls me a name caller, my first reaction would be to respond to the moral cudgel that, they just got, no, I'm not a name caller. I didn't mean to name call or whatever. I'll say whatever. Or the hypocritical move where I say, well, actually, you just called me a name caller, which is name calling.
Mm-hmm.
My approach there, fierce fallibilism, is, or actually I call this inverse psychology, that is to see both sides of something. Of course I name call, like you just did calling me a name caller. The difference is that you accuse me of name calling as if you don't do it, whereas I'm interested in, I want to name call right. I don't want to just name call. I want to name call with surgical precision. It's obviously
Right.
of no interest to you.
Right.
So you embrace the thing as half of what you do. Mm-hmm. If someone calls me a hater, I say, of course I hate, like you, like it. So that comes out of the research.
Right.
But the much more fundamental one, I call gum babying. It's actually the same concept as tar babying, mm-hmm. but tar baby is considered a pejorative. It's considered a racist term now, though that's not its origins. Gum baby is what they called them in Africa. Mm. So basically what you're doing is when you gum baby, you're accusing someone of something in a way that no matter how they respond, the accusation sticks. Mm. So if I said you're being defensive, you can either be quiet or you can say, no, I'm not, which is defensive.
Right.
Okay. So I think it's an unfair, it's a cheap trick with normal people, but I think it's absolutely essential when you're dealing with an asshole, which is you don't take their bait on anything.
Right.
You simply focus on that they are one-trick phonies, that they will say or do anything to pretend that they're triumphant. Mm-hmm. And no matter what they do in response, it will affirm it. Mm-hmm. That is, you just be dogged about it, just mm-hmm. relentless, no matter what else they're constantly trying to frame the debate. They want to be the umpire over the debate you've entered with them.
Right.
I call that Trumpiring.
Mm-hmm.
And no, you ignore all of that and said, look, he did it again. Or you did it again. Once again, you're right about everything. Everybody else is wrong about everything. Nothing else matters to you. That's not true. You're wrong. They'll come back with whatever. See, he did it again. Mm. And you just do that. I'm not saying these work perfectly. I'm also saying they're completely unsafe in lots of situations.
Yeah.
Slavery lasted 12 generations in the United States, 250 years. The idea that there's a surefire way to stop assholes, no, apparently not.
No.
It's a tragic effect here, but we still have to do what we can to make it cost them when we can get away with it.
Beautiful.
And Trumpire and gum babying, this idea of just not... Don't enable them by taking anything they say seriously, because that's not where they live.
That's right.
They live in the wild card, trump card formula where they can do anything and whatever they do is always best. Right. And you have to just focus on that, which is also why I spend a long time trying to figure out what's really going on with them, because once you know what's going on with them, your intuitions about whether you're dealing with one will improve.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's learned as well, so it's like you've evolved to have that gene on picking up on when you're dealing with an asshole. Right. So, Jeremy, how can people find your books and learn more about you?
I have a new website, jeremysherman.com, where you'll find what's built out right now is the media page, where you'll find way too much of me in all media formats. But also the homepage is a very succinct and clear, accessible, intuitive way of understanding my entire research project, which turns out to be eight big questions that keep me going. And then the other thing is, if you just Google Jeremy Sherman, you'll find way too much of me. And if you look for the podcast, What's Up with A-Holes, you'll find it too.
Beautiful. Okay. And we'll make sure that we put that link in the show notes. Jeremy, I just want to thank you so much for this lively discussion.
Thank you.
Here on Self Talk.